I submitted my application to the Architectural Review Board on a crisp Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that carries just a hint of promise in the air. The sun was barely up, dew still clinging to the grass, and I remember thinking, maybe foolishly, that this was the start of something good. After all, I'd done everything right, or so I thought. The binder I handed in was thick, 15 pages, neatly organized with color-coded tabs. It was more than just an application, it was a labor of love. I had poured hours into compiling every detail I thought they might ask for and several they hadn't. It was professional, thorough, passionate. I walked out of that office with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from believing in the work you're doing. Inside that binder was the story of the barn. Not just its present state, but its past, a full historical account. I'd spent weeks tracking down public records, talking to the county historian, even digging up dusty photographs from local archives that showed the barn in its prime. Tall, proud, weather-worn in the best way. It was built around 1870 by a farming family who'd homesteaded the land before there were even paved roads in the area. Over the years, the land had changed hands, the farm disappeared, and subdivisions had swallowed the fields, but the barn remained, stubborn and steadfast. It had been there before street signs and sidewalks, before Margot Lace's neatly trimmed flower beds and HOA bylaws. It had seen generations come and go. And now, I wanted to give it a new chapter. I didn't just stop at the history, though. My proposal had architectural plans drafted in CAD software, down to the millimeter. Each beam was labeled. Each roofing replacement was accounted for. There were sections on period-accurate materials, preservation techniques approved by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and a proposed timeline that followed the seasons to avoid moisture damage. I even included letters from 3 restoration architects who vouched for the plan, along with glowing endorsements from preservation societies in the area who were ecstatic to hear about someone reviving such a structure. They'd called it a rare and valuable example of rural American architecture, and an irreplaceable piece of living history. That's not just fluff, that's real heritage. And still, despite everything I'd gathered, I couldn't shake the feeling that none of it would matter. Maybe it was the look on the receptionist's face when I handed over the binder, polite, professional, but completely unreadable. Or maybe it was just the echo of Margot's perfectly glossed words from that first conversation, "You'll need to go through the proper channels." The way she'd said it hadn't been guidance. It had been a warning. A coded message that this wasn't about aesthetics or preservation. It was about control. Still, I clung to hope. I gave them 2 weeks. That's what the guidelines said, 2 weeks for the review board to respond. During that time, I kept myself busy on the property. I didn't touch the barn, of course, not a single nail. But I mowed the grass, trimmed the hedges, planted wildflowers around the front of the house. I wanted to show I was a good neighbor, someone who cared about the community. The barn loomed behind me every day as I worked, a patient giant, waiting with me. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Nothing. I sent a polite follow-up email. No response. I called the HOA office. The woman on the phone told me the board was reviewing the matter and would respond soon. I asked if there was anything else they needed from me, more documents, clarifications, anything. She paused, just long enough to be noticeable, and said, "Not at this time." It felt like being stonewalled with a smile. Another week passed. Then came the second letter. This one was even colder than the first. It acknowledged receipt of my application, but said that my proposed restoration did not meet the aesthetic criteria outlined in the HOA design guidelines and was therefore denied. Denied. No explanation. No suggestions. No opportunity to revise. Just a flat rejection and a deadline. I had 30 days to bring the structure into compliance or face daily fines. I stared at the letter in disbelief. I'd spent months researching, planning, documenting, and now they were telling me no, just like that? Not because it was unsafe. Not because it was structurally unsound. But because it didn't match the aesthetic criteria. I couldn't even begin to understand what that meant. What aesthetic criteria applies to a century-and-a-half-old barn that predates every house on the block? What aesthetic are we talking about, cookie-cutter suburban beige? The more I read the letter, the angrier I got. I walked out to the barn that evening, letting the cool air settle my thoughts. I remember standing there with my hands in my pockets, looking up at that sagging roofline and thinking about my grandfather again. He would have laughed, shook his head and muttered something about fools in suits and the death of common sense. But more than that, he would have told me not to back down. If it's worth building, it's worth fighting for, he used to say. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. So I appealed. I found the clause in the HOA bylaws that allowed for a formal hearing before the board. I wrote a letter requesting it, citing historical exemption provisions, and submitted it with a second binder, this one even more detailed than the first. I added new letters from local residents who supported the restoration. I collected data from appraisers showing how preserved historical structures can actually raise surrounding home values. I even included a petition signed by a dozen neighbors. A few days after I submitted the appeal, something unexpected happened. I got a knock on my door. It was a neighbor, Sandra, who lived 2 houses down. I'd barely spoken to her before, just a few waves in passing. But that day, she stood on my porch holding a tray of cookies and said, "I heard what the HOA's trying to do. It's ridiculous. I think that barn is beautiful." I invited her in, and we talked for hours. She told me about how her kids played near the barn when the previous owner was still around. She said it gave the neighborhood character, made it feel like it had roots, not just some clone development. That night, she posted about the barn on the neighborhood Facebook group. And to my surprise, the post exploded. Dozens of people chimed in. Some were cautious, not wanting to step on HOA toes, but more than a few were outraged. Turns out I wasn't the only one who'd had run-ins with Margot and her minions. There were stories of people being fined for having too many wind chimes, for planting unauthorized tulips, for using the wrong shade of white on their garage doors. One guy said they tried to ban his vintage truck from being parked in his own driveway because it lowered curb appeal. The more people talked, the more absurd the stories became. And suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. The barn had become a kind of symbol of the neighborhood's history, yes, but also of its fight against overreach. It was no longer just about me restoring an old structure. It was about standing up to the arbitrary, petty control that the HOA had been exercising unchecked for years. By the time the hearing date came around, I had allies. People showed up. Some wore pins that said "Save the Barn." One older gentleman, who'd lived in the neighborhood since the 70s, spoke passionately about preserving local history. Another woman brought photos of her grandfather's farm and talked about how the barn reminded her of it. Margot sat at the head of the table, her smile tight and her eyes colder than ever. I presented my case calmly, methodically. I walked them through the documents again, answered questions, even offered to host a community open house once the barn was restored. But I could see in Margot's face that her mind had been made up before I even walked in the room. Still, the pressure was mounting. Other board members glanced around nervously. People were watching. And the tide was turning. When the vote came, it was close. 3-2, in my favor. I was stunned. The barn was safe. The restoration could begin. As I walked out of that hearing, people clapped. Some shook my hand. Others offered help, labor, tools, even food during long workdays. That night, someone stuck a small wooden sign in my front yard. Burned into it with a soldering iron were the words, "Let the wood tell you what it wants to be." That's when I knew, this wasn't just a win for me. It was a turning point for the entire neighborhood. And believe me, things only got wilder from there. But that's a story for another time. If there was ever a moment I questioned the entire course of my adult life, it was when I stood in my front hallway holding that cease and desist order. The paper, although no heavier than standard office stock, felt as if it were weighted with stones, with silence, with the cloying, oversweet perfume Margot Lacey wore, and most of all, with an arrogance that echoed back to the worst kinds of unchecked authority I'd ever encountered. The kind that hid behind bylaws, signatures, and laminated nameplates. That piece of paper didn't just say "Stop restoring your barn." It whispered something deeper: "You are not in control. We are." I didn't move for a long time. The sun had dipped low behind the hills, casting long golden shadows through the front window. I stood in that hush, reading and rereading the document, the legal jargon flickering between the lines of everything I had poured my energy, history, and family memory into. It was a direct assault, not on some casual hobby or DIY project, but on the very thing that tethered me to my roots. To my grandfather. To why I became a preservationist in the first place. And it was all because of Margot Lacey. Before this, I would have said I wasn't one to make enemies. I tried to believe the best in people, maybe to a fault. But as I stood there, the ink of that paper still drying in my hands, I realized that Margot didn't just see me as a neighbor. She saw me as a challenge to her authority. An intruder on the kingdom she believed she ruled with polished nails and passive-aggressive smiles. This barn, this piece of weathered American craftsmanship, wasn't just wood and rusted hinges to her. It was rebellion. It was disobedience. But what she didn't understand What people like Margot never understand, is that people like me don't scare easy. You can push us, yes. You can even knock us down. But when you come for the things we love, the things we believe in, we dig our heels into the earth like old oak trees. We don't just fight back, we become impossible to move. Still, I'll admit, for a few hours, I didn't feel like a mighty oak. I felt more like a splintered branch, one wind gust away from snapping. That night, I barely slept. I paced my living room, listening to the quiet creaks of the house, watching shadows crawl across the ceiling, wondering what the hell I had gotten myself into. I kept asking myself the same questions. Was I crazy for thinking I could take on this restoration in an HOA-run neighborhood? Was I naive to think people would appreciate history over curb appeal? Was this barn worth the battle? The answer, deep down, came quickly, yes. 1,000 times, yes. So the next morning, after downing 2 cups of strong black coffee, I took that same cease and desist order, folded it carefully into my jacket pocket, and got into my truck. I didn't have a plan yet, just a growing need to do something. That's when the thought hit me, if Margot wanted to play the legal game, if she wanted to throw the book at me, maybe it was time I learned how to read the book better than she ever could. I drove straight to the Millbrook Public Library. Not the flashiest of places, but the sort of building that made you feel more grounded just by stepping inside. The walls were lined with thick wooden shelves, the floors a scuffed but spotless oak, and the whole place smelled faintly of old paper, floor polish, and quiet determination. It was the kind of place where history lived quietly, waiting for someone to come looking. I made a beeline for the local history section. I wasn't sure what I'd find, maybe old zoning maps, maybe documentation of the neighborhood's development, maybe even something to prove that the barn predated the HOA's jurisdiction entirely. I wanted to believe there was something there. A loophole. A shield. A technicality. Anything. The hours that followed felt like wading through molasses. I pored over tax records, land deeds, zoning regulations, decades-old planning commission notes. I scanned black and white photographs of the township from the late 1800s, flipping through microfilm reels and scanning yellowed newsletters printed on dot matrix printers. I traced the ownership of the property back to a family named the Lamberts, early settlers who had once owned all the land now divided into suburban lots and tidy cul-de-sacs. Still, nothing I found gave me the leverage I was hoping for. No special historical designation. No protection status. No mention of the barn in any preserved heritage record. It was as if the barn had simply existed in silence all these years, unnoticed and unloved by anyone but me. By late afternoon, the sun was slanting in through the tall windows, casting long stripes of light across the worn reading tables. I sat there, surrounded by open books, feeling the kind of tide that sinks into your bones. And I'll admit, I started to lose hope. But just when I was about to pack it in, I found it. In an old township newsletter from 1973, wedged between an article about the firehouse's annual pancake breakfast and a notice for dog licensing, was a short piece titled Millbrook's Last Standing Farm Structures. It was barely more than a few paragraphs, but there it was, a black and white photo of my barn, albeit younger and sturdier looking, sitting proudly behind the same property lines. The article spoke briefly about its construction, estimated around 1872, built with hand-hewn beams, original stone footings, and the signature cross-gabled roof popular in the post-Civil War era. My heart started to race. This wasn't just a barn. This was documented, photographed, archived. Proof. Even better, the article noted that at the time of writing, a vote had been raised at a local historical society meeting to apply for landmark status, though the outcome was never followed up on in the newsletter. I quickly scribbled down every name, every date, every location mentioned, snapping phone photos of the article and its context. I rushed to the front desk, where the librarian, a kind-eyed woman in her 60s with half-moon glasses, peered over her desk. I need to know if the Millbrook Historical Society still has these meeting minutes from 1973, I asked, probably sounding more breathless than I realized. She looked at me over her glasses, blinking slowly. That would be in the annex, but I'm not sure if those records were ever digitized. Let me make a call. 15 minutes later, I was sitting at a different table, this one tucked in the back corner of the archives annex, with a folder in front of me labeled MHSA Minutes, 1973. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. There it was, on page 14. Motion introduced to consider landmark status for the Lambert Barn, Lot 17A, currently on property now belonging to the Havisham Estate. Vote to send documentation to County Historical Registrar passed unanimously. A note scribbled in the margin, in faded blue ink, read, filed with County Recorder's Office, July 2, 1973. I sat back in my chair, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. That filing meant something. If the county historical registrar had even a partial record of this designation request, or better yet, an approval, it could legally shield the barn from HOA overreach. Landmark status, or even an official designation process started in good faith, might legally supersede HOA authority depending on state law. At the very least, it gave me a concrete argument. A lever. A wedge to force open the door Margot was so determined to slam shut in my face. I packed everything, photocopies, notes, photos, and left the library just before sunset. The sky had turned to lavender and gold, and the air smelled like cut grass and warm asphalt. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope settle back into my chest. Not just the fragile, maybe this will work kind. But the real kind. The kind that comes from facts. From history. From knowing the truth is finally on your side. Margot had wanted a war. Well, now I had my armor. And I was done playing defense. My eyes were burning from staring at microfilm, and my back ached from hours hunched over cracked vinyl chairs and crumbling old record books. I had already leafed through more dusty folders than I could count, each promising some glimmer of information only to leave me frustrated and squinting under the flickering library lights. I was at the end of my rope. Ready to throw in the towel, chalk the whole day up as a dead end. But just as I began to pack up my things and admit defeat, something stopped me. That small, stubborn part of me that refuses to quit whispered, "Check one more folder. Just one more." That's when I noticed it. A battered, water-stained manila envelope shoved halfway to the back of a bottom drawer in the Miscellaneous Property Surveys, 1987 box. The label was crooked, handwritten in fading blue marker, and peeling at the edges. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. I hesitated, hand hovering over it. Then I pulled it out and flipped it open. I swear, I got lucky. And I don't mean finding a quarter on the sidewalk lucky. I mean scratch-off lottery ticket on your birthday lucky. Buried deep between a bland water damage report and an outdated zoning variance application was a single yellowing sheet of paper that made my heart nearly stop. It was just one page, stained with what looked like an ancient coffee ring in the upper right corner, and curling slightly at the edges from years of neglect. But its contents? They changed everything. At the top, typed in uneven, slightly misaligned letters, like someone had pounded them out on a reluctant typewriter with a faulty key, was the title, Survey of Structures for Potential Local Heritage Designation. My eyes scanned down the list, not daring to hope, not daring to believe. The names blurred a bit, smudged and dusty, until, there it was. Number 47. Structure, agricultural barn, mid-19th century. Location, parcel 17A. Historical significance, high. Noted for original timber framing and contribution to early settlement economy. My barn. I read it again. And again. My mouth went dry. My fingers tightened around the page like someone might walk by and snatch it from me. It wasn't just a barn anymore. This was formal recognition. This was documentation. This was proof. The document had been signed, by the Millbrook Town Planning Committee and, in faded ink at the bottom, stamped filed with County Clerk's Office. I could hardly breathe. For a moment I just sat there, staring at the page, hands trembling slightly. I looked around the quiet corner of the library, half expecting someone to pop up from behind the stacks and tell me it was a mistake. That this kind of thing didn't just happen to desperate homeowners on random Tuesday afternoons. I mean, who finds their salvation in an unlabeled envelope stuck in the back of a drawer? Apparently, me. I nearly shouted out loud in excitement. Truly. If I hadn't been in a library, I would have jumped to my feet, let out some kind of primal victory yell. But instead, I clamped my mouth shut and smiled so hard it actually hurt. My skin buzzed with adrenaline. After weeks of feeling cornered, of being hounded by violation notices and passive-aggressive HOA letters, of watching Margot Lacey parade around like the self-appointed queen of neighborhood order, I finally had something solid. Something real. This barn wasn't just mine anymore. It was a recognized part of the town's history. A structure noted for its cultural significance. And now I had proof that it had been earmarked for protection before most of the current neighborhood even existed. I practically ran to the reference desk, clutching the document like a first-place trophy. I must have looked insane. The librarian, a woman in her early 60s with calm eyes and a demeanor like a friendly school teacher, didn't even blink. "I need information about heritage protection laws," I blurted. "Specifically, What kind of protections are offered to structures on a local registry? She raised an eyebrow, nodded, and pointed me toward a corner workstation where I could access the state's legal database. What followed was 2 of the most intense hours of my life. I waded through legal statutes, state preservation policies, and municipal ordinances, my head spinning from all the dense language and cross-reference clauses. My vision blurred more than once, and my coffee had long gone cold, but eventually, I struck gold again. It was called the Heritage Preservation Act, a piece of state legislation passed in the early 1990s. Designed specifically to safeguard historically significant buildings, it offered protection from a wide range of threats: demolition, neglect, and, yes, even interference from overzealous homeowner associations. According to the law, any structure listed, or considered for listing, on a local heritage registry was shielded. The law affirmed the owner's right to maintain and restore the structure without obstruction from private residential governance bodies, HOA included. My heart pounded. I printed everything I could, copies of the statute, supporting legal opinions, even previous court cases where homeowners had successfully defended their rights under the law against HOAs. By the time I left the library, I had a thick folder bulging with documents that felt like armor. This was my weapon. My defense. My answer to Margot. Still, I wanted a second opinion. Someone who understood the legal nuance better than I did. That's when I thought of Arthur Reed. Arthur lived across the street from me. 75 years old, retired from a long career as a corporate attorney, and with a mind as sharp as the hedge clippers he used in his immaculate front yard. He always struck me as the kind of man who had seen everything and was rarely surprised. I chatted with him now and then, about tomatoes, the weather, HOA politics, but never anything deep. That evening, I walked over to his garden, folder under my arm like a suitcase full of secrets. He was pruning his roses, sun hat tilted back on his head. "Arthur," I said, "I think I found something. I could really use your opinion." We sat at a small wrought iron patio table while I laid out the documentation. His eyes scanned the papers, occasionally narrowing, occasionally lifting in interest. When he got to the survey page, he actually smiled. By the time he finished the summary of the Heritage Preservation Act, he let out a low whistle. "Owen," he said, tapping the table, "you just found the shield Margot can't penetrate. This statute is state law. That means it overrides HOA regulations. If your barn is recognized as a heritage structure, even preliminarily, then she's got no legal ground to stand on. This is your ace." He leaned back in his chair, a nostalgic look drifting across his face. "You know," he said, "this reminds me of a case I handled back in '92. Massive development company wanted to raise a courthouse to build a strip mall. Everyone thought we were doomed. But we had the law, same kind of thing you've got now. It's a hell of a thing, realizing all the money and politics in the world can't beat the truth when it's protected by statute." Together, we organized the documents into sections: statutes, registry documentation, case precedent, and Arthur helped me draft what he called the nuclear option, a formal written notice informing the HOA that I was proceeding with restoration work under the authority of the Heritage Preservation Act, and that any attempt to interfere would constitute a violation of state law. Arthur, ever the tactician, advised I file everything with the HOA office exactly 1 week before the next scheduled board meeting. That way, they'd be forced to address it publicly, on the record, with minimal time to prepare any counterattack. "Margot thrives on control," he said. "Take it away, and you'll see her scramble." As I walked back across the street that evening, the sunset bathed the neighborhood in rich hues of orange and rose. My folder felt heavy in my arms, but this time it wasn't the weight of burden. It was strength. It was leverage. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a shot, not just at winning, but at reclaiming my sense of peace. And yet, as I stepped through my front door, I couldn't shake a creeping unease. Margot didn't seem like the type to back down gracefully. Something told me this was just the beginning. Exactly 1 week later, I showed up at the HOA's monthly meeting held in the overly air-conditioned community center, folder in hand, nerves barely contained. I arrived early, claiming a seat in the back row, strategic and shadowed. Residents trickled in slowly, a group of about 30, most of them looking like they'd rather be at the dentist. Then Margot walked in, 5 minutes late as always, wearing a navy blazer that gave off an air of municipal intimidation. When the meeting began, it droned on in typical fashion: budget reports, landscaping grievances, a dispute about someone's Halloween decorations still being up. Then Margot stood. "We have a serious violation to address," she said, and her eyes locked on mine like heat-seeking missiles. I could feel the room shift. Everyone turned to look at me, some curious, others uncomfortable. Margot began her presentation like a lawyer in a courtroom drama. She had photos, charts, correspondence printouts, and a dramatic timeline. She painted me as a rogue element, someone threatening property values and the harmony of the community. When she finished, HOA President Richard Sterling asked if I had a response. I stood, folder in hand. My voice shook, but not from fear. From readiness. I'd like to present documentation under the state's Heritage Preservation Act, I said. And just like that, the tide began to turn. Underscore 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 underscore. Someone behind me whispered, "She's losing it," just loud enough for others to hear, the words slicing through the silence like a needle. I didn't turn to see who said it. I didn't have to. The energy in the room shifted palpably, like a slow, rolling thundercloud had just passed over the crowd. I saw Richard, our typically mild-mannered HOA president, looking down at his papers, suddenly very interested in his pen. His knuckles were tight around it. A few people in the front row had their phones out now, holding them up in plain view. They weren't even pretending to be subtle about it anymore. They wanted evidence, proof. Something was happening, and they could smell blood. Richard had already started flipping through the folder I handed him, my documents, the survey, the legal statutes, the notes Arthur and I had prepared, and I could see his expression begin to shift as the pieces came together. He started out skeptical, but with every page he turned, his brow furrowed deeper. He paused, went back to reread a paragraph, underlined a section with his finger. Then he looked up, directly at Margot. "Margot," he said, his voice low but heavy with accusation, "why didn't you mention any of this when we discussed Owen's case?" He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The calm disappointment in his tone carried more weight than shouting ever could. Margot blinked once, twice. Her face flushed, then tightened. "This man is trying to circumvent our authority with legal loopholes," she said, her voice rising in pitch as she gestured toward me like I was some kind of criminal mastermind. Her composure was cracking like ice on a warm day. "You think this paperwork gives him immunity? It's manipulation." Arthur was right. Watching Margot realize, in real time, that her power wasn't absolute was like watching a dam burst. One moment she was stone-faced and smug, the next, she was scrambling to patch the leaks in her authority with arguments that were weak, desperate, and increasingly unhinged. She claimed that heritage protection only applied to structures that were actively maintained, that my barn was too deteriorated to qualify. She argued that I needed a different kind of permit, one that didn't actually exist. Then she pivoted and said my documentation might not be authentic, questioning whether the signature on the 1987 survey was even real. Each time she spoke, her credibility eroded a little more. Richard finally had to call for a recess. The murmurs in the room had grown into full-blown side conversations. Margot stood frozen, red-faced, as neighbors gathered in tight clusters, whispering and glancing in her direction. I slipped out quietly, not because I was scared or ashamed, but because I had already won. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. I dreamed about the look on her face when her carefully constructed little empire started to wobble and crack. By morning, I was a new man. I called my contractor before breakfast and told him we were back in business. He sounded relieved. By 10 a.m., hammers were ringing, power tools were buzzing, and the air around my old barn thrummed with life again. Sawdust filled the air like golden fog. I was up on a ladder, balancing carefully as I worked to replace some damaged roof beams. Sweat beaded down my back, and I had wood dust in my hair, but I didn't care. For the first time in a long time, things were moving forward. That's when I heard the sirens. At first, I thought it was an ambulance or maybe a fire truck on the nearby highway. But the sound got closer, too close. Then I saw them. 2 police cruisers with flashing lights turned onto my street and pulled into my driveway like they were busting a meth lab. The red and blue lights reflected off the barn's weathered boards, casting warped colors across the aged wood, painting the scene like some kind of surreal, dystopian art installation. Dogs began barking across the neighborhood. Curtains fluttered in windows. Heads popped up like prairie dogs from porches, doorways, and driveways. You would have thought I was a fugitive on the run. I climbed down slowly, hammer still in my hand, wiping my palms on my jeans. My stomach twisted. I genuinely wondered, just for a second, if they were about to arrest me for fixing up a 100-year-old barn. 2 officers stepped out. One was older, gray at the temples and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The other was younger, tall and lean, his radio already crackling with chatter. "Sir," the older one said, squinting at me. "We received a report of illegal construction activity. Noise disturbance. Possibly working without proper permits." I stood there, dust-covered jeans, messy hair, sunburnt neck, blinking in disbelief. "You're kidding," I said, the words slipping out before I could filter them. He didn't laugh. So I did. A short, bitter laugh, half frustration, half pure absurdity. "Let me guess," I said, glancing across the street. "Anonymous complaint." The officer checked his notepad. "Yes," he said. "From a concerned neighbor." I turned my head and, surprise, surprise, there she was. Margot, standing in her front yard, arms crossed like a proud parent watching their kid win a spelling bee. Her smirk was unmistakable. She wasn't even pretending to hide the fact that she'd called the cops on me. Not this time. By then, a crowd had started to gather. People casually wandered onto their lawns. One woman in yoga pants held her coffee like she was watching a parade. Mr. Tran from 2 doors down crossed his arms and nodded toward me in solidarity. The neighborhood had turned into an audience, and the show was Margot's latest stunt. The officers spent several minutes reviewing the documentation I handed them, the same pages I'd given the HOA, now in a plastic sleeve for protection. The younger officer radioed back to dispatch, probably confused about how he'd gotten dragged into a petty dispute involving century-old timber and overzealous bylaws. After a few tense minutes, the older officer finally turned back to me. "Sir," he said, "everything appears to be in order here. You have the right permits and legal protections. We're not sure why this was escalated to us." He paused, looking over at Margot, then back at me. "I'd suggest documenting any further issues and reaching out to the city attorney if this keeps up." The younger cop didn't say much, just shook his head in that universal way cops do when they've seen too many small-town feuds go off the rails. As they pulled away and the flashing lights disappeared, I stood there watching Margot. She hadn't moved. Her smirk had wilted slightly, but it was still there. A brittle expression, full of pride and desperation. That's when it hit me, Margot had overplayed her hand. She wasn't just in the wrong. She was exposed. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that Margot tucked her tail between her legs and slinked back to her house to reflect on her behavior. But tyrants don't retreat. They reload. In the days that followed, it felt like we were living under siege. Violation notices started appearing in mailboxes like unwanted junk mail. Not just mine. Everyone's. It was like she had taken a red pen to the entire community. No one was safe. The Boyd family got hit first. Their grocery store's hand-painted sign, a charming piece of neighborhood history, was suddenly non-compliant. 2 wide by 2 inches, per an obscure line in Section 12 of the HOA's commercial signage guidelines. Fixing it would cost them hundreds. Then came Mrs. Weller. Sweet, soft-spoken, 82-year-old Mrs. Weller, who received a violation notice for planting sunflowers in her front garden. Apparently, they weren't on the approved flora list. She'd grown them for 10 years in the same spot. Her hands trembled when she showed me the citation. She didn't cry, but she came close. Another neighbor, Steve, from 3 houses down, was cited for painting his garage door the wrong shade of gray. Not the wrong color, just the wrong shade. It was listed as light charcoal, but Margot's new favorite code enforcement strategy demanded deep slate. The difference? Almost imperceptible unless you were standing 2 feet away in full daylight with a color swatch. Even the Hendersons got hit. Their mailbox was allegedly mounted 3 inches too high. A teenager left their recycling bin out 15 minutes early and got flagged. A family got cited for using solar lights that created glare. It wasn't enforcement anymore. It was punishment. One afternoon, as I stood in my driveway taking a water break from barn work, Tom Boyd stormed over, violation letter in hand. "Owen," he said, his face red with frustration, "you seem to know how to fight these people." He showed me the citation. Fixing the sign would cost over $800. I told him about the Heritage Preservation Act, how I'd used it to protect my barn, but it wouldn't help with signage. That's when I made my biggest mistake. I assumed that people would just take it. That they'd grumble, complain quietly, maybe post on Facebook and then move on. But something had changed. The mood on the street was shifting, turning. And Margot, in her desperation to control the narrative, had accidentally started a revolution. Let me know if you'd like the next installment, the moment when the community finally decides enough is enough and starts fighting back. I always thought I'd be standing alone when it came time to face Margot. After all, that's what she counted on: fear, isolation, compliance. She wielded power through intimidation and subtle threats, and it worked. People paid their ridiculous fines and lowered their eyes at meetings, too afraid to speak up and too tired to fight. I assumed I'd have to challenge her solo, with nothing but a dog-eared copy of the HOA bylaws and my stubborn pride. I hadn't planned to lead a resistance. I wasn't the neighborhood rebel. I just wanted to keep my grandfather's barn, a weathered but beautiful structure that had stood on our property for over 60 years, from being torn down because it didn't meet aesthetic standards. But maybe that barn had a purpose beyond nostalgia. Maybe Grandpa, in his stubborn old way, had left me more than a rickety outbuilding. Maybe he left me a reason to stand up. A symbol. And I couldn't have imagined how quickly others would rally to it. The day after I received my violation notice, I was sipping lukewarm coffee on my porch, mentally rehearsing arguments and legal loopholes, when a knock came at the door. I opened it to find 5 neighbors standing there. Not 1, not 2, 5. 5 faces, 5 envelopes, and 1 shared look of quiet resolve. They didn't need to speak. Their expression said it all: enough. There was Mrs. Harrow, the elderly widow from 3 doors down, clutching her violation letter like it was a court summons. Apparently, her offense was growing sunflowers taller than regulation height. She looked more confused than angry, as if someone had accused her cat of tax fraud. Then there was Darren, a software engineer who'd been cited for having a non-conforming garage door color, even though it had been the same shade of slate gray for over 5 years. He blinked down at his envelope as though it might morph into something sensible if he stared hard enough. Even people I barely knew were there. Folks who used to wave from across the street but never ventured onto my porch. All holding HOA citations. All beginning to realize something wasn't right. We gathered on the porch like survivors after a storm, comparing violation notices as though they were rare trading cards. The deeper we looked, the clearer it became: this wasn't random. This wasn't standard enforcement. This was something far more calculated and sinister. Every citation listed infractions that would have gone unnoticed or outright approved just weeks earlier. And every single fine was steep, hundreds of dollars, some even over 1,000. Not warnings. Not requests. Financial hits designed to coerce. I saw it on their faces: the fatigue, the stress. These weren't wealthy people with money to burn. These were neighbors living on pensions, raising families, paying off mortgages. The sudden burden of unexpected fines had weighed down their shoulders, tightened their voices, shortened their tempers. And as they spoke, the suspicion that had quietly been gnawing at me bloomed into something undeniable. That's when Tom Boyd changed everything. Tom owned a small home improvement store on the edge of the neighborhood, the kind of place where people still paid in cash and got hardware advice for free. He was practical, friendly, and didn't waste words. As we stood in the sunlight with envelopes in hand, Tom stepped forward and said, "I think I know where this money's going." A few days earlier, he explained, he'd received a delivery at his store that didn't belong to him. A delivery truck pulled in with a massive order of upscale furniture: oak dining tables, plush leather sofas, high-end decorative pieces. The delivery was addressed to the HOA office, but the driver had gotten the address wrong. Curious, Tom opened the shipping slip and blinked at the total: over $8,000 worth of furniture. When he contacted the delivery company to sort out the mix-up, they told him it had all been delivered to the correct address the previous week. That correct address, it turned out, was Margot's home on Maple Street. Tom's wife, Gwen, had seen the truck outside Margot's place around the same time. Now, that might have passed as a coincidence. Maybe Margot was storing things for the HOA office, maybe the delivery company got addresses confused again. But then Tom recalled something else. Just a month prior, the HOA budget report had included a line item for office renovation: $8,100. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a breadcrumb. Tom showed us the copy of the receipt he'd made. I held it in my hands, and the paper felt heavier than it should have, like I'd just been handed the first piece of a puzzle that revealed something rotten at the core. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces clicked together. The sudden uptick in violation notices. The selective enforcement. The targeting of anyone who dared question the board's authority. This wasn't just about making the neighborhood look nicer. This was a cover-up. Margot was using the HOA to fund a lavish redesign of her own home, and she was using fines collected from her neighbors to do it. The gravity of it sank in slowly but deeply. And with it came a responsibility I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't about saving my grandfather's barn. It was about defending an entire community from a woman who'd turned a position of trust into a private bank account. Word of the receipt spread like wildfire. Within 48 hours, our quiet street had transformed into something closer to a courtroom. We were no longer just neighbors. We were witnesses. We were jurors. And Margot? She was the defendant. We met in kitchens, in garages, on back patios lit by citronella candles. The first gathering was at Tom's house. 3 of us showed up. Then 5. Then 10. Laptops were opened. Files were compared. Somebody even made spreadsheets. The elderly widow with the sunflowers, her name was Mrs. Delaney, turned out to be a retired librarian and surprisingly skilled with digital archives. She started scanning documents, photographing violations, logging everything in a shared drive. We were clumsy at first, amateurs playing detective, but our resolve made up for our inexperience. And as angry neighbors often do, we got real serious real fast. Tom and Gwen began tracking the delivery trucks in the neighborhood. The following week, they spotted the same company making another stop at Margot's house. This time, Gwen filmed the crew unloading boxes, and Tom got a close-up photo of the invoice taped to one of them. It listed custom window treatments and decorative accessories, totaling another $2,400, all billed to the HOA. He called the delivery company again. They confirmed that yes, the items were charged to the HOA account, just like before. That brought our running total to over $10,000 in personal purchases, funded by neighborhood fines. Within a week, Richard called an emergency session with the remaining board members and a few trusted residents. At that meeting, he made it official: the HOA would be undergoing a full financial audit. A professional accounting firm was brought in, one with no prior connection to the neighborhood or its board. They worked quickly, methodically, and when their report was presented, it left no room for doubt. Margot had stolen not just thousands, but tens of thousands of dollars. The auditors found fake invoices for landscaping projects that had never been completed, inflated repair costs on minor work, and a string of consulting contracts paid to a shell company registered in her maiden name. It wasn't sloppy, it was deliberate, organized, and systematic. At the next community meeting, Richard shared the findings with everyone. The room was packed again, but this time the atmosphere was different. People were alert, engaged, and united by a shared sense of betrayal and purpose. Gone were the resigned sighs and quiet frustrations of past meetings. In their place was energy, real, actionable momentum. "I'm forming an oversight committee," Richard announced. "One with rotating membership and full transparency. We'll have quarterly reviews, open books, and a built-in whistleblower mechanism." Tom Boyd stood up almost immediately. "I'd like to chair that," he said. "Let's make sure this never happens again." That's when I raised my hand. My heart was pounding, but I knew this was the moment to speak. I'd been thinking about this for weeks, ever since I first started investigating Margot's actions. It had started as a frustration over my barn restoration delays, but it had grown into something bigger, a desire to fix the underlying structure that allowed abuse to flourish in the first place. "I have a proposal," I said. "It might sound a little radical, but I think we've earned the right to think big." The room quieted. Every eye was on me. What if we based HOA fees not just on property value, but on actual community contribution? I said. People who constantly create problems, violations, complaints, disruptive behavior, they should pay more. Residents who contribute positively, volunteering, maintaining property, participating in governance, should pay less. And here's the kicker: those who help uncover corruption or prevent abuse. They should be rewarded with significant fee reductions. There was a long pause. I could see people thinking, some nodding slowly, others skeptical but intrigued. Then, Mrs. Lannister, the elderly woman who'd lived in the neighborhood for over 3 decades, raised her hand. "That's the fairest thing I've heard in years," she said simply. Tom Boyd grinned. "It's like behavior-based insurance, but for neighbors." Richard chuckled. And here I thought my job might actually get harder. We put it to a vote that very night. The motion passed with overwhelming support, almost unanimous. It felt like the beginning of a new era. Over the next month, the new board worked tirelessly to develop clear criteria for the new fee system. They created an appeals process, built in safeguards, and opened everything up to resident feedback. 2 months later, my first quarterly HOA statement under the new system arrived. I had to read it 3 times to believe it. My fee, which had been $300, was now $120. Along with it came a letter. This reduction, it read, is in recognition of your positive contribution to community governance and your role in identifying financial irregularities that harmed the entire neighborhood. Thank you for helping us restore trust and integrity to our HOA. I set the letter down and just stared at the bill. It wasn't just the money, though saving $15,000 over the next 10 years wasn't trivial. It was the principle. For once, fairness had won. Accountability had actually meant something. And the victories didn't stop there. News of Margot's actions and the resulting audit had spread. As word got around, the social fabric that had once supported her began to unravel. She found herself increasingly isolated, even in the broader community. Eventually, facing civil litigation, criminal investigation, and a neighborhood that no longer feared her, Margot put her house on the market. It sold for 15% under market value. The buyers had negotiated aggressively, citing the documented HOA dispute and pending legal action as risk factors. A portion of the proceeds, thanks to the civil suit brought by the HOA, was recovered and used to replenish the community fund and pay for long-delayed improvements. One of those improvements was my barn. 3 months after the audit concluded, the final phase of the restoration was complete. The old structure now stood proud and solid, a blend of historic charm and modern durability. The local historical society even featured it in their newsletter, calling it a rare and inspiring example of preservation done right. Neighbors began stopping by just to admire it. One told me it had become their favorite spot to walk past in the evenings. Another said the restoration had actually raised their home's appraised value. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I was part of something good, something real. The barn had started as a personal project, something to honor my grandfather's legacy. But somewhere along the way, it had become a symbol of something larger. A rallying point. A line in the sand. As I mounted a wooden sign behind it, a small plaque commemorating the structure's restoration, I realized that this wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about resilience. About standing firm. About refusing to be bullied by petty tyrants in positions of power. That barn saved me more than I saved it. And maybe that's what legacy really means. Margot? Last I heard, she'd moved to another neighborhood on the other side of town. Maybe she'll change. Maybe not. But around here, we've learned something important. Community isn't about domination or control. It's about showing up, working together, and holding each other accountable. I'm still here, still in the same house, with the most beautiful barn in the neighborhood and $15,000 saved over the next decade. Not a bad outcome for a fight that started with a simple request to fix a rotting beam. So tell me, have you ever gone toe-to-toe with your HOA? Ever seen a community rise up and take back its power? Drop your story in the comments. I promise, I read every one. And if this wild ride made you feel a little less alone, give it a like, a share, or even a subscribe. This is QA Stories. Sometimes all it takes is one barn to rebuild an entire neighborhood. And we're just getting started. The end.